Good morning, everybody. So today we pick up on where we left off last time with Beach Walk Blog 5, where we opened the doors on talking about strength training. So let's just start to recap just briefly. Strength training is increasing the capacity of muscles to produce force in the right place at the right time with the right movements, with the right muscles, the correct movements. Not the incorrect ones, not the wrong ones, not the ones we don't want. It's the ones we do want. It's also training muscles to produce more force. And when I say the right muscles at the right time, what I also mean is the correct muscle fibers. Now, muscles consist of different muscle fibers, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but let's just think of them as fast twitch and slow twitch. There are others, but I just want to focus on those two types. Now, fast twitch fibers are our real high force muscle fibers. They produce lots of force very quickly. They're super explosive and they fatigue very quickly. They also use lots of glycogen, and those are the muscle fibers in our muscles that we're going to use for, say, sprinting or explosive movements or high force movements. Now, when we talk about running, and specifically endurance running, we're using much more slow twitch muscle fibers, which are fatigue resistant. They use more predominantly fats as fuels. They operate in the aerobic capacity much more than the fast twitch fibers, and they produce lower levels of force rather than high levels of force. Now, that is the bit I want to talk about much more today, because last week we talked about the correct muscles in the right place at the right time with the right movements. And today I want to talk a little bit more about the correct muscle fibers. So we've just said about slow twitch muscle fibers. Now, it doesn't mean that they're really slow and they produce force in slow movements. They're actually quite fast in how they produce force, but not as fast as the fast twitch fibers. Now, that doesn't mean that slow movements are the ones that we want to do. Because obviously aerobic running in the aerobic capacity, so below our lactate threshold, and maybe a little bit above the lactate threshold as well, is really predominantly using those slow twitch fibers. Those are the ones that we really need to focus on. But again, we need to incorporate the correct muscles with the correct movement in the correct time, or with the correct timing in the right place, in the correct place. So in order to use those slower twitch fibers, we do produce less force, but we produce it with higher number of repetitions. Now, I know that there is research out there, and I don't disagree with the research that says that in order to get stronger, we need to use lots of force. Now, that's true, and I don't dispute that one bit. However, that's not what endurance running is. So we've just agreed with that research, but we've also said, yeah, but that research doesn't really, or that type of strength training doesn't really cover what we want as endurance runners, that is. Now, if you were a bodybuilder or a power lifter, then yes, absolutely, you'd need to be doing incredibly high force and very specific strength training, which would be 4 to 6 repetitions with as much weight as you can possibly manage, and pretty much get to failure point at around 4 to 6 repetitions. That's not using the right movement with the right muscles at the right time in the right way for the running movement, because remember, strength is specific to the movement, the velocity of the movement, the muscles that we use, the range of motion, the stability profile, whether it's stable or unstable, whether it's endurance or pure strength, so high repetition, low repetition. All of these things must be taken into consideration. So we're basically back to square one again, which is Strength is specific to the movement. And if you're not training the movement, then you're not training the correct muscles. So yeah, you know, we can kind of argue back and forth about strength training, but we come back always come back to specificity of strength training, or specificity of training, the specificity rule. So we're back to that again, because it really is that if you're not training the correct muscles, the correct movements, I'm going to sound like a broken record, and I don't want to do that, but I really do want to make it as simple as possible. So we talk about the strength training, and the last thing that I talked about on part 1 was about why do so many runners get the same injuries, and those injuries tend to be hamstring injuries or calf injuries or foot injuries. So think about that for a second. Strength training is supposed to, and I wish I could show you air quotes, supposed to negate injuries. So if you're doing the right strength training, or the correct strength training, then shouldn't that be loading the correct muscles in the correct place at the correct time, with the correct force at the correct velocity, with the correct range of motion? I would say yes, and I don't think anybody could argue with that. I think that would be a very silly argument to have. So how is a squat doing that? Because a squat is predominantly loading your quads, some glutes as well, and yeah, there's some hamstrings, but it's not doing what the running movement requires, which is producing rotational force, rotational power in the hip extension movement, where the foot is hitting the ground at an incredibly fast speed, and also at a fast rate of repetition, right, 2 to 3 times a second. It's incredibly fast, and producing lots of force with high velocity. Now, I posted on the Revolutionize Your Running page today about, and yesterday, about velocity of movement. And this is the bit that I think that most people are missing, is this velocity part. Because if I throw a ball, a tennis ball, and it goes at, let's say it goes at 100 miles an hour, I'd be an incredibly good thrower if that were to be the case, but let's say it was. Let's say we're a baseball pitcher, threw a baseball at your head at 100 miles an hour and it hit you in the head. That would really hurt. Really hurt. But to produce 100 pounds of force with a 100-pound weight, that doesn't have to move very fast. So you see the difference between the two. If I were to do, let's say, a bench press with 100 pounds, I don't have to move it very fast to produce 100 pounds of force. But it's very different from a baseball coming at your head at 100 miles an hour that weighs less than half a pound. Do you see the difference? That's like your foot hitting the ground. Your foot doesn't weigh very much, but it hits the ground at an incredibly fast velocity. And also the speed, the time, the amount of time that it takes for your foot to go through its pronation and supination pattern as it loads your body weight over the top of it is completely and utterly different to doing a squat. Because it's a high weight with a low velocity in a squat, but in running it's a low weight with a high velocity. And this is why I think, and why I feel, that a lot of runners are not getting what they want out of their strength training, because like we said in the last part 1 of Beach Walk Blog part 5, was that you're training the wrong movements with the wrong muscles at the wrong time with the wrong velocity profile, with the wrong force vector profile, which is either you're pushing a weight up and down, so for example like doing a squat, or you're doing something like a hip thruster, the basic 8 hip thruster with the resistance bands. That's a horizontal based profile, because your resistance bands, the resistance, the load is coming from in front of you rather than on top of you. It's a very different profile of the movement. Okay, so let's go back to why runners are getting hamstring injuries and calf injuries and plantar fasciitis and all of these different things. Now, your strength training certainly isn't going to be working on your foot strength and your pronation and supination actions and the profile of plantar flexion, so pushing off the ground with the ball of the foot and creating that super stable arch and the rigid lever that our foot must be in order to push off of. So if you're not working on creating that rigid lever at the right place at the right time at the right velocity, then you're not working on the right thing in order to make your foot really powerful, really strong, in order to hold you up above it. Now think about something like plantar fasciitis. Now the definition of plantar fasciitis, let's call it plantar fasciitis. We really know it's a fasciosis, but anyway, let's just call it plantar fasciitis for ease of what everybody knows of that injury. It's not a tight plantar fascia. It's not that, okay? It should be. You should have a tight plantar fascia, because if you don't have a tight plantar fascia, in fact a taut plantar fascia, because it needs to be taut, it needs to be pulled taut so that it can support your foot. Now if it's not supporting your foot, then it's not supporting your ankle. If it's not supporting your ankle, it's not supporting your knee, it's not supporting your hip, it's not supporting your torso, and the plantar fascia is not able to do its job. Okay, so think about that. As your foot hits the ground, it needs to be mobile, it needs to absorb the shock and the impact forces, and then we need to create this super stable lever that the foot needs to be in order to get through toe off. Now your strength training isn't doing that. Your strength training isn't getting that to occur, especially if the heels are staying down on the ground for 99% of the time, right? So think about a deadlift and a squat. They both require your heels to stay down on the ground. Does that happen when you run? No, of course not. All right, then you go and do a plank, and you've got your toes curled under, you're stretching everything out in the lower part of the leg and the foot. That's not creating a nice stable lever. That's not strengthening those calves up and the hamstrings up, right? So none of that's doing what you need it to do. That's not training your body to produce the running movement, a powerful running movement, is it? No, of course not. You can't train your body to produce a running movement if you're face down looking at the ground. You've got to be standing up. You have to be. Because that's the profile of the movement. That goes back to the basic fundamentals of strength and conditioning. Strength is specific to the movement, the action of the movement, the velocity of the movement, the force vector. Is it vertical or horizontal? Am I pushing up and down, or am I moving forwards and backwards and sideways? Right? So again, we're back to that. If you keep it that simple, it really is that simple. Just take the movement, break it down, train those movements, and then put it all back together again with some drills. Okay? That's how simple it can be. That's how simple it should be. And that's what we've done with the Sling method, or that's what I've done with the Sling method, is take all of the pieces of the puzzle with the right place, the right movement, the correct movement in the correct place at the correct time, with a pretty close to it velocity, and said, here you go, this is your strength training. And people have said, well, how is that strength training? You're not using weights. Well, how is it not strength training? Because I'm using resistance bands. Resistance bands give me resistance, therefore it's resistance training. And I'm training the correct muscle fibers in the correct muscles because I'm training the higher repetition range. So if we go back to basic rules of strength and conditioning, we look at repetition ranges. So what I said before about the if you were to train for example, powerlifting, you'd be training vertically. You wouldn't be training horizontally like we do as runners. You'd be training vertically, up and down, and you'd be training with incredibly heavy weights for you, because obviously that is relative to you, not anybody else. And you'd be training in the 4 to 6 repetition range to get the maximum strength from the correct muscle fibers, right? So as a powerlifter, you're training with the correct movement, with the correct muscles, with a fast velocity and also a slow velocity to train the force side of the equation. But they're doing it in the correct movement, which is what runners aren't doing. You have to be training the correct movement pattern, the correct movement, in order to be strength training for that movement. So I'm going to share a picture in the comments section of this Beach Walk blog. This is obviously when it goes onto Facebook. And I'm going to show you, just as an example, something that I found the other day. It's a picture of a lady who's trained for a whole entire year, from December one year to I think it's 13 months she trained for, and you can see this massive difference in her body. It's actually pretty cool. She's done a great job, but there's absolutely no change in her calves. None, not a thing. In fact, her calves even look smaller than they did a year ago. And this is the kind of thing that I see a lot, is going back to the why are runners suffering with calf injuries and hamstring injuries? Well, because they're training the wrong movements, period. You're not training your calves to do what calves should do when you run. It's got to be fast. It's got to be with a horizontal action, a horizontal resistance. So the resistance has to be coming from behind you, because remember, as the foot does that, comes off the ground, that movement is a forward movement. So the resistance must be coming from behind you to create that resistance to the forward action. It's not an upward action. It's not an upward action. It's a forward action. It's a rotational movement around the foot, or over the top of that foot, that rigid lever, the foot. But you can't create the rigid lever if your foot muscles aren't being trained very well, right? And think about the speed at which the foot is landing. You've got to train that velocity of movement, because it all has to happen so quickly. You're not training that, right? And remember what strength training is. Strength training is not hypertrophy training. Hypertrophy training is 8 to 12 repetitions and almost getting to failure in a movement that should be one of the movements that you should be training. Not bicep curls, not bench presses, not squats, not leg presses. These are all the wrong movements, remember. And not 10-minute planks, because that's crap as well, right? So you should be, if you're training for strength, not hypertrophy. There's a whole different goal. It's a whole different repetition range for hypertrophy. And we can talk about that another time in another blog, because that's an interesting one as well. And I see that mistake being made all the time as well. Oh, I'm doing my strength training, but I'm doing completely the wrong repetitions. Okay, so strength training should either be really low reps with really high weight, really high resistance to create really high amounts of force in the muscles to get compensation in those tissues, because we're increasing the capacity of the tissues to produce and resist force, right? Or It should be high repetition with lower resistance, but still in the same movement profile, to train the slow twitch muscle fibers. So we brought it all the way back round to training the correct muscle fibers again, in the correct movement with the correct force profile. Okay, so once you've got the movement down, once you've got the movement pattern down, and you've got the force profile, either vertical, horizontal, or combination of, you can start thinking about repetition ranges. So do I want to do high resistance, low repetition? Well, you can't really do that so well with a horizontal force, because it doesn't work very well. It really doesn't work that well, right? You can only really do that for a few seconds at a time. That's sprinting. But endurance running isn't that. It's using the slow twitch muscle fibers, which are very fatigue resistant, fatigue resilient, in a low force, high repetition, quick profile of movement. It's very unstable. It's on one leg with pronation and supination, right? That's not squatting, remember? Okay, so you're training, your strength training, to increase the capacity of the muscles, the fascia, the tendons, the ligaments, all of those great things that are inside of us. All right, and if you're training the wrong movement, you're not training those muscles and fascia and tendons and ligaments to get the capacity that you want them to get. So I hate to say this word, but it's an epic failure. Unfortunately, I did that for a lot of years. I epically failed with my strength training because I was doing all the wrong things. And I was a certified personal trainer with certifications in kettlebells and Olympic lifting and strength training and blah blah blah. You know, a number of really high quality personal training certifications behind me, still doing all the wrong things because not following the basic strength and conditioning rules, which is what most people are doing, including the strength and conditioning coaches that say that they're working on strength and conditioning. They're breaking their own rules. So are all the physical therapists out there and the physiotherapists out there. If I want to increase the capacity of muscles, tendons, fascia, ligaments to withstand, resist and produce force in the right place at the right time with the correct movement profile and the correct range of motion and the correct force vector with centripetal and centrifugal forces, I need to train all of that. I've got to train those things, right? Because that's what running is. That's what running is, that's what it demands, that's what it produces, that's what it needs. Right? So why are we still doing squats? Why are we still doing planks? Why are we still doing side planks? Why are we still doing deadlifts? They're not bad exercises, right? I know people think that I'm hating on all of those things. I'm actually not. I watched somebody doing I don't know, I think it was like an 8-hour plank the other day, and I thought to myself, my goodness, the amount of training time, actual training time that went into holding an 8-hour plank. I think it was 8 hours. That's incredible. It's absolutely phenomenal, but it isn't what runners need to do. Right? I watched somebody the other day doing an Olympic clean and jerk, I think it was, and it's incredible. It's absolutely phenomenal, but it isn't what runners need to be doing for improving their running or becoming injury free or even fixing their injuries. Right? I watched somebody the other day do 400 push-ups. 400 push-ups. It's phenomenal. Right? It's absolutely phenomenal what human beings can do. But that's not what runners need. Right? 1,000 burpees. Saw somebody do 1,000 burpees the other day. It's phenomenal. Of course it is. I watched the world champion CrossFit athlete I'm not sure what to call them, CrossFit competitor, there you go. And I thought to myself, geez, that's phenomenal, it's really phenomenal. But it isn't what runners need, right? So let's do our sciencing. Let's look at runners producing the running movement. Let's look at the kinematics, what we see visually, the kinematics, and also study the kinetics, because that's the forces that we're producing and resisting. And let's put it together and let's come up with something really great for runners, for endurance runners, because up until now, up until the Sling method, there's been nothing that does it for runners, endurance runners. Now sprinters can get a lot out of the Sling method as well, they absolutely can. A little bit different though, and they'll need to do extra stuff that endurance runners won't need to do and shouldn't really be doing, because it's different. But there's similarities, right? You still want to be hitting the ground with a backward traveling leg, which is being pulled back from the hip extensors. You're still hitting the ground pretty hard at fast velocity. Obviously sprinting's much higher velocity, much higher force, much more power, much less time. So a 10-second sprint is nothing like a 2-hour marathon, 3-hour marathon, 4-hour marathon, 5-hour marathon, 6-hour marathon, right? It's nothing like it, but it's similar. It's similar in its movement profile. Okay, so let's wrap this one up. If you're not training the correct movements, you're not training the correct muscles. If you're not training the correct movements, you're training the incorrect movements. If you're training the incorrect movements, then you're strengthening the wrong muscles, the wrong tissues. If you're training and strengthening the wrong tissues, then you're creating weakness where you don't want to create weakness. Okay? It's one of the reasons why runners are still getting injured, because they're not training the capacity of the tissues that they want to train in order to withstand what they need to withstand. Okay? So when you do that, you're training, like I said, the wrong movements, the wrong muscles, the wrong tissues to withstand the wrong forces at the wrong time. And also when you do that, you create the weakness in the other areas that you don't want weakness in incapacity. They are incapacitated, I like that word, and thus creating weakness, and that's why you're still getting injured. That's why you won't find clamshells and sideways band monster walks in the Sling method, because there's no need. It never occurs in gait. You're training the wrong thing. That's why you'll never find planks in the Sling method or side planks, because it doesn't happen. You're training the wrong thing. That's why you won't find stretching in the Sling method, because you're doing the wrong thing. You're incapacitating those tissues to produce force, right? So there we go. Strength training. You're either increasing the capacity of the right tissues, the correct tissues in the correct place at the correct time, or you're not. Okay, you've got to be doing the correct things in the correct place at the correct time, and that means that you've got to be working with horizontal force. And if you're not using resistance bands, you can't do that. You cannot do that. If you're not swinging a load, if you're not swinging a weight around like we do with Indian clubs, kettlebells, kind of, but it's the wrong movement again. It's the wrong movement. You're going up and down in a squat or a deadlift. See, it's still the wrong movement. So Indian clubs, we use circular movements which create centrifugal forces, which demand centripetal forces from you and I, from us, from the person. Okay, so that's the correct movement pattern, the correct movement profile with the correct force profile. All right, so you see how it all works, see how it all fits together. All right, train the right movements, increase the capacity of the right tissues to withstand the load and the demand that you're asking of them, and they'll be able to. It's just that simple. It's the right movement at the right place at the right time. And there we go. That is what the Sling method is all about. The correct movements, correct place, correct time, correct force profile, correct velocity, close to, using the correct muscle fibers to get the correct result. And that is Beach Walk Blog 5 Part 2. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to give us a like. YouTube, subscribe to my channel. Help me grow, help the Sling method grow, help runners get what they need. Share it on Facebook. Show some love. Take care. Have a good week. Bye-bye.